No matter our background, what we do for a living, or where our interests may lie, we all have at least one thing in common: fear. Fear can take the form of almost anything the mind can drum up. Some simple ones that come to mind may be the fear of heights or public speaking. But fear can also root itself in other ways that we may not even think about until we are thrown into that situation. Most of the time, we are able to see these problems coming and are able to act before it digs in. But sometimes, it strikes when we least expect it. Fear can be debilitating, affecting more than we wish to admit. Face your fears head on, or you'll never be truly happy. I'm sure you've heard this common phrase thrown around very casually. But what if you weren't exactly given a choice? Tossed right into a situation that was fight or flight, with no ability to control the outcome? If that were the case, and you were thrown into the open ocean 100 miles from shore and completely surrounded by sharks, you would then be able to somewhat relate to the crew of the USS Indianapolis. In July of 1945, under almost unfathomable circumstances, the situation these men faced continued to go from bad to worse, with little to no control over it. So, if you have a fear of possible drowning, sharks, or impending doom, then listen on. Today I bring you the bizarre story of the USS Indianapolis. I'm Bradley Hall, and you're listening to Episode 9 of Beyond the Harbor. Launched in 1931 and officially commissioned in 1932, the USS Indianapolis was a $10 million American cruiser. The vessel had thin armor, making her light and fast. But because of the 8-inch guns mounted on the deck, the Indy was classified as a heavy cruiser. During the 1930s, the Indianapolis played host to a striking figure of the time. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt, along with 6 of his cabinet members, made a quick sail to Annapolis, Maryland, the home of the U.S. Naval Academy. Again, in 1934, Roosevelt embarked on the Indy for a naval review, which was basically a glorified parade of ships. These reviews were usually done to show naval strength, but it not being a time of war, it was possibly just to assess the exact firepower we had at our disposal. In 1936, the Indy hosted Roosevelt for a third time, this time for a goodwill cruise to several South American countries, including Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. It was during this trip that Roosevelt and his team completed a line crossing ceremony. He was quoted as saying, quote, "The intensive initiation lasted 2 days, but we have all survived and are now full-fledged shellbacks," end quote. To anyone unfamiliar with this, it may sound very serious and important. However, a line crossing ceremony only commemorates a person's first time crossing the equator. After a decade of parading and running around the president, the fun and games that the Indy had known come to an abrupt halt with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Fortunately, though, the Indy was not in port at Pearl Harbor during the attack. Instead, they were conducting a mock bombardment at Johnson Atoll, roughly 720 miles to the southeast. This training exercise spared the entire crew from devastation that ensued at Pearl Harbor. While they were freed up and ready for active service, they were immediately sent out to hunt down the Japanese ships that were responsible for the attack. After about a week at sea, they were unable to locate any of the Japanese fleet and returned to Pearl Harbor. World War II was now on, and the crew of the Indianapolis was ready. While not necessarily a battleship, the Indianapolis had a substantial track record of wins in the Pacific during the early years of the war. In early 1943, the Indy was escorting a couple of battleships to the Aleutian Islands when they intercepted a Japanese 3,100-ton cargo ship. After some surveillance, they noticed the ship was laden with supplies for the war, including troops and ammunition. Upon recognizing that it was not a civilian ship, instead carrying dangerous supplies and manpower for the war efforts, the Indianapolis shelled the Japanese cargo ship. The ship immediately exploded with all of the ammunition stored on board and sank, sending all hands into the ocean. But as karma tends to do, it eventually would find its way back to the Indy, but not until they could get a few more wins under their belt. In 1944, the Indianapolis was named the flagship of the Fifth Fleet and was commanded by Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. Under Spruance, the fleet was fending off Japanese forces so the Allies could make landfall at New Guinea. During that time, the Fifth Fleet sank 3 destroyers, 17 freighters, 5 oilers, and inflicted severe damage to another 17 ships. The Japanese tried to counterattack from the air, but the fleet was able to keep them at bay and received no damage in return. The fleet then had several encounters during the Battle of Saipan and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. After these battles, the Indy returned to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, just outside of San Francisco, California, to undergo a refitting and overhaul. After the renovation in 1945, the Indianapolis headed back out to the Pacific, this time with a new lead man in charge, Captain Charles McBay. McBay was 46 at the time of being handed the command. He was also a graduate from the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Their first mission with McBay at the helm was sailing directly for Tokyo to help carry out attacks on the Japanese homeland. Soon after their successful attack on the Japanese capital, they headed directly to Iwo Jima to support the troop landing to take over the island and control the air base. The noteworthy battles of the Pacific and World War II that the Indy was a part of just keep growing. After the ground troops took over the island of Iwo Jima, the Navy then began the invasion of Okinawa. They spent 7 days dropping their 8-inch shells into the beach's defenses in hopes of crippling the ground forces. Up until this point, all had been golden for the crew of the Indianapolis. The track record of wins and battles it had taken part in was unmatched. But with all the sunshine it had, there was bound to be a little rain, and it was soon on the horizon. While the ground forces invaded the island of Okinawa, the Indianapolis lookouts spotted a Japanese dive bomber emerging from the morning twilight. It pointed its nose vertical, straight down to the bridge of the ship. The 20mm gun started to roar as they tried to fend off the kamikaze. The pilot, swerving and trying to miss the barrage of lead coming from the Indy, managed to release his bomb roughly 25 feet above before crashing into the sea. It was a direct hit. It plummeted through the deck and into the crew's mess hall. It continued down through the fuel tanks before flying through the keel and exploding in the water just below. It blew a couple of massive holes into the bottom of the ship's hull, sending water rushing in. The propeller shafts were damaged, the fuel tanks were ruptured, and the water distilling equipment was wrecked. After all of this, she remained afloat. Fortunately, though, the bulkheads protected the flood from spreading to the rest of the ship's compartments beneath. The bomb claimed the lives of 9 crewmen and sent the Indy back to Mare Island Navy Yard again for repairs. It was just after the ship was patched up on July 16, 1945, when Captain McBay and crew were given the most top-secret orders in naval history. At the time, not a single soul on the ship, including McBay, were to know the contents of the cargo they were instructed to transport. The orders that were relayed were to sail directly from San Francisco to the Tishan Island as fast as they possibly could. 2 cylindrical containers and a large crate were loaded onto the Indianapolis for the transport, accompanied by 2 Army officers to keep an armed guard of the cargo at all times. As Seaman First Class Clarence Hirschberger recounts, quote, "Rumors started flying all over the place. Wagers were being made and everybody was betting on what the crate contained. They were wagering it was anything from a new type of airplane engine to scented toilet paper for General MacArthur. Needless to say, nobody ever collected a nickel on that bet." End quote. The Manhattan Project scientists had just finished up the creation of the world's first atomic bomb, and they needed to move the uranium core of the weapon safely and quickly, within striking distance of Japan's homeland. And that's exactly what Captain McVeigh and the crew of the Indianapolis did. On July 26, just 10 days after departing San Francisco with the prize cargo, they arrived at Titian Island, which was dubbed simply as the destination by the Manhattan Project scientists. They were greeted with a mini armada of motor whaleboats and other small vessels, all containing high-ranking military officers to offload the cargo. The pier was riddled with military police and troops to oversee the atomic bomb, dubbed the Little Boy, safely make its way to land. After the successful delivery of the highly classified cargo to the island of Titian, the Indy made a stop in Guam. On the 28th of July, McVeigh and his crew set sail on a routine trip leaving Guam for Leyte, Philippines. The trip was around 1,200 miles west across the Philippine Sea. Before turning the propellers west, McVeigh inquired about the situation of the journey. He had been out of the active war since Okinawa about 6 months prior. Commander of the Pacific Fleet, James Carter, responded to McVeigh saying, quote, "Things are very quiet. The Japanese are on their last legs and there's nothing to worry about." End quote. This, I'm sure, put Captain McVeigh at ease for the seemingly normal trip across the Philippine Sea. Of course, the commander of the Pacific Fleet would know if there was any serious posing threats ahead, right? Not so fast. You see, the commander in this instance was dead wrong. At midnight on July 30th of 1945, just 2 days after departing Guam, the Indianapolis found itself in the crosshairs of a Japanese submarine. As the Indianapolis was considered a heavy cruiser, it wasn't equipped with the high-tech sonar that the battleships of the time had on board. A truly fatal flaw. As Seaman First Class Santos Pena recounts, quote, "I heard an explosion which knocked me off the ready box, knocking me on the deck. I had no time to get off the deck before I heard the second explosion. I got up as soon as the second explosion and looked forward and found the whole bow was gone. I tried to get communication between Sky Control and the bridge using sound power phones and the ship's service phones, but both were out of operation." End quote. The first torpedo from the submarine smacked into the Indy's starboard bow, killing dozens, if not hundreds of men instantly. A few seconds later, a second torpedo struck the Indy, this time around the middle of the ship. This second explosion ignited the aviation fuel in storage, and a massive explosion soon followed, crippling the ship, this time for good. Seaman Second Class Don McCall recalls the events as they unfolded. Quote, "They tell you to throw your life jacket in first, then jump in and get your life jacket. I looked over the ship's rail, and there was too many guys who didn't have a life jacket. I decided when I got there, I was going to have one. I strapped mine on before jumping overboard and went through the Navy procedure, holding onto the collar when you hit the water. It felt like my legs were going down and my top was going up. When I hit the water, fuel oil and seawater went down my throat. I was gagging and spitting and trying to swim away from the ship. I finally threw up and got rid of most of it. But then when I ran out of air, I stopped and looked back at the ship, and it was going down." End quote. In just 12 minutes' time, the Indianapolis had sunk below the water's surface. It was roughly 280 miles from the nearest shoreline. Around 300 men went down initially with the ship, those who were killed in the explosion, and others like Chief Warrant Officer Leonard Woods. Woods remained in the radio shack as the ship continued taking on water, trying to send out an SOS message as quickly as possible. He ordered his men to abandon the radio shack, but he stayed firm, trying to get the message out. He was never seen again, and was presumed to have remained in the shack as the ship headed quickly for the bottom of the ocean. The remaining 900 men who made it to safety, if you will, into the water alive, found themselves swimming in a sea of fuel and oil left behind from the Indy. Their shelter, food, and water was abruptly taken from them. Something they never expected to happen, happened. And now the fear of being alone on the open ocean was beginning to set in. Or so they thought they were alone. The dangers the enemy submarine posed were over. Even though many survived the sinking, they quickly came to the realization that things were only going from bad to worse. Stick around a minute, and we will discover what became of the 900 men who initially survived the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. The first day of bobbing in the ocean after the Indianapolis sank the previous night, the men that survived seemed to be in good spirits. Well, as best they could be under the circumstances they were in. With no shade around for hundreds of miles, the men were left baking in the summer sun. Signalman 3rd Class Paul McGinnis described what it was like on that first day. Quote, "It was very miserable because of the sun burning the skin. One could not escape it. It was like having your head in a hole in the middle of a mirror, with all of the sunlight being reflected and burning your face. So hot, it was miserable, like hell. You couldn't wait for the sun to go down." End quote. He gives us exactly an idea of what it was like to be there on the water, not having any clue whether they would be rescued or the enemy would sail up and execute them. But the men had much more to worry about than just the Japanese Navy. Some of them were getting so thirsty that they began drinking the salt water right out of the ocean. Now, I don't know if they were just unaware at what this does to you, or were just exhausted and needed some relief. But one thing was for sure, the men who were drinking the water were becoming very delirious. It was later reported that some of them even had knives and began fighting and tried to kill each other, some even succeeding. This kind of hopeless feeling would only grow darker. As night fell, the men were relieved to finally be able to escape the heat of the sun. But relief would only last for about an hour. With the sun down, nightfall became very cold. With the men in the water, they would shiver uncontrollably, almost begging for the sun to rise again. On the second day is when the apex predator of the ocean decided to show up and assert their dominance. Some believe it may have been the explosion of the ship that drew them in. Others think it was probably the blood of the fallen. Either way, hundreds of sharks were circling the site. They began to feed on the dead, and when that didn't do the trick, they began stalking the living survivors. The fear of death by dehydration soon became the fear of being eaten alive. They began noticing that some of the men that were floating off by themselves were being targeted by the sharks, so they acted. Many of them formed groups and conducted shark watches to keep them close together and allow them to kick and slap at the sharks to keep them away. It seemed to be working. The sharks were staying away from the larger groups. Until on the third day in the water, when the sharks were relentless. As Boatswain Mate 2nd Class Eugene Morgan recalls, quote, "All the time, the sharks never let up. We had a cargo net that had styrofoam things attached to it to keep it afloat. There were about 15 sailors on this, and suddenly, 10 sharks hit it, and there was nothing left. This went on and on." End quote. As if starvation and dehydration weren't enough, the men were constantly in fear of the attacking sharks just feet below them, slowly circling around. No one knew who would be next. The only thing they did know was that they all weren't going to make it out alive. By day 4, most of the men had given up hope of a rescue. The dead now outnumbered the living as the terrible conditions continued to bear down on them. Dehydration from the brutally hot days, coupled with cases of hypothermia from the frigid nights, was wreaking havoc on the men. But it was on this 4th day at sea, on August 2nd, that the men spotted something. It was a plane, but not just any plane. It was a U.S. naval aircraft. The men began splashing the water and yelling with their hands high above their heads. It didn't immediately appear that the plane had saw them, but just as it was getting to the point of where it would have went completely past them, it made a dive directly over the top of them. The PV-1 Ventura aircraft was piloted by Chuck Gwynn when he radioed back to command that he saw many men adrift. Gwynn immediately swooped down and dropped a life raft and a radio transmitter in the middle of the sea of men. For a brief moment, it seemed like the threat had ceased, and the men were finally going to be rescued. And that's the way it seemed to Fireman First Class George Horvath, as he was very close to the life raft that Chuck Gwynn had tossed into the sea. He was about to find out that the threat was still lurking too close for comfort. Quote, "Rescue planes dropped this one survival craft close to where I was, and I thought, geez, there's got to be water on that. After 4.5 days, you get pretty thirsty. So I left the big group I was in, and I headed to the craft. Of course, I couldn't swim all the way to it, so I stopped and had to rest on my life jacket. That's when I happened to glance down in the water. There was a shark looking back at me, and I said, 'Not now, Lord, not now.'" End quote. George would turn out to be one of the lucky ones. Out of 900 men that lived through the torpedoing and sinking, only 316 men would be saved from the devastation. Also among the survivors was Captain Charles McVay. I'm sure he was relieved to finally be free from the grips of death, but his nightmare was far from over. He became the first captain in the U.S. Navy to be court-martialed in connection with the loss of his ship. In February of 1946, he was found guilty of negligence for failing to steer his ship in a zigzag pattern to avoid and evade Japanese submarines. If you recall, he was explicitly told that he was in safe waters and that no immediate threats were nearby. During the trial, the commander of the Japanese submarine was present to testify. He stated that steering the ship in a zigzag would not have prevented the torpedo attack on the Indianapolis. Yet, even with this, McVay was still found guilty on the count of negligence. A few years after his trial, it came to light that the U.S. Navy in fact knew that the Japanese submarines were operating in that area, but failed to notify McVay. Some believe they didn't want to alert the Japanese that they had broken their secret coding system. Either way, the whole tragedy could have possibly been avoided. But it wasn't the end of his story. In 2000, U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution exonerating Charles McVay. The resolution that was passed absolved him from any blame to the loss of life on the Indianapolis. It took 55 years, but his name was finally cleared, as all signs point to him being a scapegoat, as some believed. Sadly, though, he would not live to see the day when his name was cleared. Charles McVay took his own life in November of 1968. Those closest to him say that he struggled throughout his life after the USS Indianapolis to cope with the lives that were lost at his hand. He periodically received letters and phone calls from some of the deceased sailors' family members. It seems as though the blame that wasn't due him never left him either. Over the years, many efforts were made to find the Indianapolis. However, given the fact that it lay roughly 3.4 miles below the surface and uncertainty about its location, the wreckage remained a loss. That was until August 2017, when it was discovered by a team of researchers led by Paul Allen, who was a co-founder of Microsoft. They sent down ROVs to view the wreck site. Some of the footage is uploaded on YouTube, and I would highly recommend taking a look at it, as the ship is preserved in the great depths at which it lay. Though we all have fears that surround our lives, I think we can all find comfort in the fact that none of us will ever have to face the dire circumstances that the crew of the USS Indianapolis faced in 1945. They faced some of the hardest challenges I've ever read about, and somehow, some way, by chance, 316 of them lived to tell their story, so that I could bring it to you. This episode was written and produced by me, Bradley Hall. If you enjoyed this story as we explored the rich history of the USS Indianapolis and her fate, please be sure to like, rate, and subscribe. You can find us on Instagram by searching for Beyond the Harbor. Questions, comments, and feedback can be left at my website. As always, if you are looking to take a deeper dive into this story, the source material as well as full transcripts used for the episode can be found on my website. Thanks for listening.